is a more straightforward one. So Samus is charging charge shot, right? And in the mid range, she has an advantage, right? Because generally she has good keep away, right? Think about something like F tilt. She has rising fair, rising up air. She has Zair. She has down B bombs. She has charge shot release. She has grab, and like all of these are like pretty solid options, right? So she has an advantage in these situations. So what we can do is, so one, we can play the situation as well as we can, and then benefit from advantage state, which generally is this is a fine way to beat zoners at like a basic level, because most zoners don't have great disadvantage. If you look at the list, right, like Banjo has a really bad down air. Villager, Isabelle are very floaty. Mega Man is actually pretty decent, but still kind of struggles to land. Easy to combo. Toon Link super floaty, right? Young Link very bad airspeed, generally abusable recovery. Rob, I know people meme about it, but Rob disadvantage is not great, right? So like most zoners don't have an amazing disadvantage. There are some exceptions, right? So for example, something like Steve has a pretty solid disadvantage. But generally zoners pretty weak once you hit them, and generally not the greatest advantage either, right? So when Samus hits you, she has a really good ledge trap. But that kind of is like the exception to the rule. If we compare it to something like, again, like Young Link, not super great as a ledge trapper. Mega Man, not super amazing as a ledge trapper either. Pac-Man, Steve, they have like setups, but it's not like they ledge trap you. It's not like they juggle you forever either, right? So that's also why characters like Robin or Byleth or Sephiroth, it's a little bit harder to see them as zoners because they don't suffer from standard zoner weaknesses, but we'll talk about that later. For now, just keep in mind that usually when you hit a zoner, you can usually get more reward than when they hit you. Yo, Kronos, audio keeps cutting out, but it's my data. Aw, don't worry about it, man. Thank you for the subscription. Thank you for the support. Appreciate it. Snake has a long air dodge. He has a standard air dodge. His air dodge is just a normal air dodge. Rising Fair is a bad option in neutral. You should tell it to the European Samuses that keep, performing really well in the US. Anyway, continuing on. One thing we can do again, right? One thing we can do, just to recap, is to just out-reward them because they generally have a worse advantage state than most of the non-zoner character does. Does Ryu count? No, I did not count Ryu as a zoner. Anyway, let's continue, right? So, the other thing we can do, and this is the better thing that I think we should do, is we should try to control the RPS through bait and punish, as well as proper mitigation, right? So bait and punish is something that everyone understands. The idea of mitigation is something that's a little bit less universal. So let's talk about the idea of mitigation, right? I think mitigation is one of the most important tools for anyone at any level of play. So the idea behind mitigation is that you aim to mitigate the effectiveness of a tool by itself. And the goal is to force your opponent to rely on other tools to actually hit you. So mitigation versus Samus, right? Like a very clear example of mitigation versus Samus is to say, okay, well, I'm not gonna let her hit me with the charge shot, right? So if we think about like her mid range, right? We can say, okay, charge shot release. This one is like her best option. We're gonna make sure that we avoid the charge shot release entirely. Now, if you look at the rest of their options, they're actually like pretty linear or, relatively poor in terms of risk reward, right? Down B bombs, these do not event her game state. Zair, extremely slow because she has one of the slowest short hops in the game. Her grab, super committal. Her rising aerial is also really, really committal. Forward tilt is okay, but it's also pretty laggy for a tilt, right? So once you get one of the options, like usually their strongest options out of the picture, then suddenly they have to rely on, well, their secondary options, which are usually a lot worse. So if you look at zoner designs, what you often see in zoner designs is that their design is not very well rounded. So if you think about, for example, a character like let's say Lucina, right? I know Lucina is a little bit cheating because she's designed to be well-rounded, but Lucina has, like she is, up close, she's like a decent, like let's say a 7 out of 10. right? In the mid-range, she's a very solid, like, let's say an 8 out of 10. And even in the long range, while she cannot do much, she's very good at closing the gap. I would say, you know, she can play a very solid long range by using her movement and baiting the opponent in. So even here, you know, she's good enough. But if you look at zoners, it's like their ranges are usually entirely based around a couple of ranges in the game. So if you think about, like, you know, if you use Pack as a zoner as an example, his long range is like super amazing, right? His close quarters, I know this looks like a C, but this is an L. His close quarter is also really good. Let's give it an 8. But his mid-range is like, you know, is his mid-range really good? Well, it's very dependent on his resources, which we'll talk about later, right? So this is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is to look at it in terms of moves, right? So if you think about Lucina, does Lucina really have bad moves? Not really, right? She doesn't really have bad moves. She's very well-rounded, right? But if you think about Samus, right? Like, Samus has Charge Shot, which is like one of the best moves in the game. And then like all of her other moves, like they're not bad, but they're also not really, really good, right? So in that sense, there's two ways to look at it, right? Two ways. So one is to think about situationally, right? And say, okay, so what situations does my opponent struggle? And the other one is move-wise, right? Which is basically what moves are the core issue. So this is kind of like the groundwork for beating any zoner in the game. RPS doesn't work very well in Ultimate. It does, because it's not the concept of attack beats shield and shield beats attack and attack beat grab. The concept behind RPS is that every option has counterplay, and every bit of counterplay that you introduce has its own counterplay, which creates an RPS system. And because we don't have perfect information when we input anything we do, because we naturally lag about 20 frames behind what is actually happening in the game, at the end of the day, you're making a double blind decision, which is like RPS, right? And the reason we lag behind is because of reaction time, as well as input delay, which together is about 20 frames. So in that sense, it's a double blind system where options beat other options, which beat other options, which beat other options, which is basically an RPS system. Now, it's not the same as RPS in the sense that, you know, like you win with an option, you get a single point. You lose with an option, you get a single point. It's the same as RPS in the sense that the system is the same, but the risk reward of every individual option is very unique. And the thing about Smash that makes it even more interesting is that while it is double blind, there's no forced timings in the way that RPS has it, right? So in that sense, the whole timing aspect of making decisions is something that you can exploit as well. So it's not just on a level of interactions and moves, but also in a level of, you know, timing and in that sense, a lot of intuition and how do I say this? Basically, how well you can read the opponent. We can bait our opponent by entering their ideal position and then change the situation. If you think about Samus, using the Samus example again, we can enter the mid-range where she has so many options and then leave again. And if she commits to anything, we are outside of the situation already, it probably won't work. So if you think about rising up air, it will whiff. Rising fair, it will whiff. Grab, it will whiff. Charge shot release, you can shield it on reaction, and she lost a resource, right? So entering their ideal position and then changing the situation, very strong way to deal with zoners. Now, the Samus is like, you know, mid-range, how proactive is she when she's that strong? And similarly, when you're in a close range, how hard are they willing to commit? So if you think about Siski, right? So Siski is a very, very clear example. Best Samus player in the world. In a mid-range, Siski is very proactive. So in that sense, when you see Siski lose, it's usually because people are baiting Siski to act first in the mid-range. Same thing in close quarters. When Siski's in close quarters, she is very, she's relatively weak. So what does Siski do? He tends to commit with a B, because he wants to get out of those bad situations ASAP. So either way, Siski is a very proactive player. So against a player like Siski, the most important thing that you notice here is how easily baitable a player like that is. Now, of course, they can still like play RPS and they can still win, but now we are controlling the quality of the RPS, the risk reward, the moves that are actually available in these situations. And let's say Siski does overcommit in close quarters and goes for an up B and he's wrong. Well, I mean, ideally you get like a smash attack or maybe a combo starter out of that, right? So again, we got to identify some moves that we want to mitigate, and then through mitigating those moves, we want to move into certain positions and then use that positional advantage or disadvantage, which is unreactable, right? In these situations where you would enter their ideal position and then change the situation unreactable or unreactably, we use the mitigation to open up our movement, which then allows us to bait our opponent out, right? That's the TLDR. So the same goes for Samus, right? So when Samus has a full charge shot, your focus should shift around denying the resource instead of getting the hit, right? So it's like this resource is always so important that it's nearly always top priority to focus on denying resources over winning situations directly, right? So again, when you play against Samus and she has her full charge shot, your focus in neutral should not be on hitting her. It should not be on anything but baiting her to use charge shot and then pressuring her when she doesn't have it. But a lot of resources also are limiting in ways, right? So when you think about Samus, well, let's talk about buffing characters in general, right? Outside of a few, which are usually the stronger ones. But if you think about Samus, right? Like if she gets full charge shot, there's no more incentive for her to charge it, right? So she's gonna use it eventually. And the question is how solid are you at baiting it out? And how good are you at mitigating her tools in the sense that you don't still get hit by a mix-up? Now, the issue is if she has charge shot, she can also use the threat of charge shot to try to get other hits. And that is where, of course, you know, like you're still playing RPS. And that is why, of course, you should play around the resource, not just in the dimension of when it's there, you should play around it, but also in the dimension of preventing it, right? Because like a lot of buffs are time gated, right? So if you think about Hero, he needs to get through his menus. That's a time limitation. If you think about Robin, needs to charge. Mewtwo needs to charge. Samus needs to charge. Wii Fit needs to charge and even has a cooldown on her down B. Pac-Man needs to charge. Steve needs to mine. And Olimar needs to pluck and toss away. All of these buffs, and you know, Rob, Young Link, Toon Link, Mega Man, and even Banjo, like all of these, as well as Snake, they all require time to set up, right? And that is something that you need to pressure. So for resources, there's two dimensions, right? So one is to pressure the resource to prevent it from becoming a strong factor, right? So, for example, pressure Samus while charging, deny Duck Hunt proper can positioning. And the other part is to mitigate the resource when it's online, right? Which is bait Samus into throwing it out. And for example, just try to like Z-catch a Toon Link bomb or whatever, you know. At the end of the day, there's a lot of variation in how you deal with resources. But the most important thing is that when you think about whether a situation is strong or not, you need to factor them in. And that's something that I see in a lot of people, is that they don't accurately balance how to deal with resources. So like Samus, when you're in a mid-range and she has no charge shot, her mid-range might not be as strong, but if she grabs you, you know, she's still gonna like, you know, back throw you, and then she gets a full charge shot. So in that sense, what you notice with a lot of zoners, right, a lot of zoners will overcommit when their resource is low to catch you off guard and get it back. So in other words, it's very, very important to focus on how your opponent behaves when pressuring her their lack of resource. Again, Samus has low charge shot. What happens if you start to pressure her for having low charge shot? She's going to commit hard to get you out of her face. She's going to dash attack you preemptively because you're overzealous, or she's going to even just shield and up you out of shield. The same goes. Baiting is always preferred over over punishing. Okay, in these scenarios, always prefer baiting over punishing, because these characters are made to keep you out, and whether it's the presence of the resource or the threat of the resource, if you let your actions be decided by the resource, then well, if you let your actions be molded by the resource, then you're still playing their mix-up. So what you got to do is you got to pretend that you're letting the resource decide your actions, and then instead do something else which puts them in jeopardy for committing themselves. What's the counterplay for the zoner if you're doing this bait to them? Yeah, so that's the thing, right? Like, let's say you're baiting a Samus to use a charge shot. What if she just keeps charging? Let's say you bait a Steve to anti-approach you. What if he just keeps mining? So their counterplay is usually to not take the bait, which keeps them decently strong, which is why, again, you got to understand mitigation, because against a lot of zoners, right, and that this is really a huge crux of this strategy. Against a lot of zoners, if they decide to not take your bait, they still don't get a hit, right? So like, let's say Samus doesn't take your bait, so you don't win the neutral. Of course she gets charge shot, but it's not like she's hitting you, right? Which is the biggest difference between doing this against like a zoner or a traditional like top tier, where like if you try to bait out Pikachu, he might just like throw out a burst range option and hit you while you're trying to bait them, which a lot of zoners just don't have as much access to, or the risk reward for doing so is a lot worse. We're trying to see how they act in those situations, and then we get that information that we can use later. So if the Steve does keep mining, if the Samus does keep charging, we can then start to apply our burst range, but only rarely, and then we go back to baiting and punishing and seeing, do they adjust their decision making. But yes, you eventually have to commit in some sort of way if they never take the bait. But if they never take the bait, that is a pattern that is abusable, just like always taking the bait. Which is also why a character like Samus can be a bit scarier in the mid-range, because her grab actually occupies the same range as her charge shot. So in that sense, she has a more complete mix-up in that situation, where if you play around the charge shot, there's more of an opportunity cost because she has a direct unreactable mix-up with her grab, which a lot of characters don't have, and her grab is actually rewarding. Which is why the way that you play around Samus in those situations is not through the use of shield, but through the use of movement. Because that is something that has relatively little opportunity cost. Again, the opportunity cost is them getting more charge shot usually. Yeah. This charge shot tether threat range is called hell. It is hard, but it's very easy to move around. And when she whiffs the grab, then she's actually in a pretty bad spot. What's up, Nover? And the same can be said for like Samus charge shot, right? When you play around Samus charge shot, there's a huge range in which it meaningfully mixes up into something like grab, which means that you want to bait. You want to bait them by threatening to enter that range. Again, enter a good range on their end, and seeing how they capitalize on that. Do they continue to relax? Do they try to get the most out of their good range immediately? All really, really important information, while you're generally giving out, you're generally giving out the same amount of information. So in that sense, you're kind of going even. But again, if you play around resources well, you usually get more reward out of your advantage state.